In the spring of 1883, the town council ordered Mia to remove her pigs. While they returned to their parlors, she took her cart to the barren hillside. Nobody expected her to build anything there. But day after day, she stacked stone upon stone, raising a structure so immense the valley folk called it a palace for swine. It looked like mad defiance. Then one winter night, fire consumed the town's public stable, and the only shelter with room for every horse was that stone pigsty on the hill. Mia had arrived in that town 5 years earlier with nothing but a cart, a sow, and a deed to a rocky slope nobody else wanted. The council called her pigs a nuisance, but the truth was simpler. Her independence irritated them. She was an unmarried woman running her own land, and that made proper folk uncomfortable. So they forced her livestock out, expecting her to sell or fail. Instead, she built that stone palace, stone by stone, through the autumn and into the first snow. The townspeople laughed, then forgot about her. But on the night the stable fire lit up the valley, every council member who had signed her order suddenly needed exactly what she had built, a fireproof shelter large enough to hold their precious horses. The question that would haunt them was whether she had built it to protect her pigs or to collect a debt she had been owed since the day they humiliated her. The town was called Clearwater, a name that promised purity and fresh starts. But like most places on the frontier, it ran on unspoken rules. Men held the deeds. Men held the council seats. Men decided which animals could graze within town limits and which had to go. In the spring of 1883, the Clearwater Town Council declared that swine were a public nuisance. They claimed the pigs rooted up garden plots and fouled the creek, though everybody knew the real damage came from stray cattle belonging to the council chairman's brother. Nobody mentioned that. At the council meeting on April 2nd, the ordinance passed with a unanimous vote. Mia received the written notice the next morning. It ordered her to remove all hogs from the town commons within 30 days or face fines she could never afford. She stood in the dusty main street reading that paper while the chairman, a man named Harlan Webb, watched from the mercantile porch with his thumbs hooked into his vest. He had never liked Mia. She didn't attend church regularly. She didn't ask for help. She wore trousers when working her land, which people still talked about years later. Mia folded the notice and walked past him without a word. That silence scared him more than shouting ever could. She spent the next 3 days walking the rocky slope she owned outside town. 40 acres of thin soil and exposed stone that the previous owners had abandoned as worthless. The slope faced north, catching every winter wind that swept down from the high country, but the stone was the point. Flat gray slabs of limestone jutted from the ground like old bones, and beneath the surface lay more. Mia knelt and tested the rocks with her hands. She had watched her father build a stone barn in Ohio when she was a girl, hauling fieldstone and fitting pieces until the walls stood true without a lick of mortar. She still remembered how he worked, patient and stubborn, and how that barn stood through 30 winters while the wooden sheds around it collapsed. On the 5th morning after the order, she loaded her tools onto the cart and drove her pigs up the slope. The sow led the way, a huge Berkshire with a white blaze on her snout, and 8 young shoats followed behind in a scrambling line. Mia didn't stop at the boundary of her land. She drove the herd into the middle of the stony field, dropped the cart handle, and began stacking stones. The first wall rose shin-high by sundown. By the end of the week, the outline of something enormous cut across the hillside. Townspeople noticed. Mr. Webb heard about it from the postmaster and rode out to see for himself. He sat on his horse at the edge of the property and stared at the trench she had dug, at the piles of broken limestone, at the foundation lines stretching far wider than any pig needed. "You're wasting your time," he called out. Mia did not look up. She set another stone into place and pressed clay into the gap. 30 days is plenty, she murmured, but loud enough that his horse shied sideways. The chairman rode back to town unsettled, though he couldn't quite say why. Summer burned into autumn while Mia worked alone. She quarried stone from a ledge at the back of the slope, prying slabs free with an iron bar and dragging them downhill on a sledge. Each stone weighed more than a grown man in some cases, but she had rigged a rope and pulley system using a stout pine as an anchor. The walls grew. Not just tall enough for pigs, but tall enough for a house, with arched openings and deep sockets for crossbeams she hadn't cut yet. A traveling stonemason from Wisconsin passed through Clearwater in early October and rode up the slope to see the work. He stood in silence for nearly 5 minutes before speaking. "Ma'am, that foundation is thicker than any barn I ever built," he said. "What exactly are you aiming to raise?" Mia wiped limestone dust from her cheek and looked at the structure towering above them. "A pigsty," she said. The mason laughed, thinking it a joke, and then realized she wasn't smiling. He left quietly with a shake of his head. By the time the first frost hardened the ground in late November, the stone palace was finished. The main room measured 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, with walls 12 feet high and a roof of heavy cedar beams covered with sod and stone. Inside, the floor sloped slightly toward a center drain that Mia had carved from a solid limestone block. The ventilation shaft at the peak drew air upward even on still days, keeping the space dry and cool. Along the back wall stood a row of iron feeding troughs salvaged from an abandoned blacksmith shop. Mia had also dug a root cellar beneath the north corner, accessing it through a trapdoor. The pigs moved in the same afternoon. 8 shoats in the old Berkshire shuffled inside, sniffed the corners, and settled into deep straw beds with the contentment of animals that know they are warm. That night Mia stood at the top of the slope and looked down at her creation, its stone flanks silvered by moonlight. The town below seemed small and far away, but the winter of 1883 would not be ordinary. The cold arrived hard and fast in December, freezing the creek solid within a week and forcing every farmer to double their feed stores. The Clearwater Public Stable, a sprawling wooden structure near the main square, groaned under the weight of the horses crammed inside. Nearly 40 animals belonging to merchants, teamsters, and council members themselves stood nose to tail in stalls meant for half that number. Lanterns burned day and night because the windows were shuttered against the cold. Hay bales stacked near the back wall made for easy kindling. Several people warned the stable master about the danger, but Harlan Webb dismissed the concerns. The town had more pressing expenses. At 2 in the morning on January 19th, a lantern slipped from its hook in the hayloft. The glass shattered, and the oil spread across dry straw faster than a man could blink. By the time the first flames licked through the loft window and the alarm bell began ringing in the town square, the entire back wall of the stable was already alight. Townspeople ran into the frozen street, still pulling on coats and boots, their faces lit orange as the fire climbed higher, hotter, and the terrible sound of 40 horses screaming began to drown out every other noise in the night. The fire consumed the public stable in less than an hour. Men formed bucket lines from the frozen creek, but the water turned to ice on their sleeves before reaching the flames. Each splash against the burning walls produced a hiss and a cloud of steam, then nothing. The structure was old pine dried by years of prairie sun, and it burned with a hunger that seemed almost personal. Inside, the horses screamed in registers no human throat could match. Some kicked through their stall doors and fled into the night with manes ablaze, galloping blind down the main street until they collapsed in the snow. Others never made it out. By the time the roof caved in, the fire had grown so hot that the iron hinges on the main doors glowed red. No one could stand within 40 feet. The bucket line broke apart and the townspeople could only watch the stable die. Harlan Webb stood at the front of the crowd, his coat open to the wind despite the cold. He had not bothered to close it in the rush from his house. His wife gripped his arm and his son, a boy of 12, was weeping openly. The chairman's own matched bays, a pair of fine draft horses worth more than most Clearwater homesteads, were stabled in the east stalls. He had boarded them there because the public stable was closer to the mercantile, and because he believed the town owed him the convenience. Now the east wall was a curtain of flame, and the roof above it sagged like a dying animal. Mr. Webb did not weep. He just stared, and in the orange light his face looked 20 years older. The fire smoldered through the rest of the night. Dawn revealed the full cost. The public stable was gone, reduced to a blackened skeleton of charred timbers and twisted nails. Frost had formed on the ashes so that the whole ruin glittered in the pale morning light like something from a dark fairy tale. Men moved through the wreckage with wet cloths tied over their mouths, searching for the bodies of horses that could not be saved. The count was grim. Out of 41 animals, only 11 had escaped alive. 3 of those were badly burned and would need to be put down before nightfall. The surviving horses stood in a shivering cluster near the mercantile, draped in borrowed blankets and steaming in the cold. Their breath made small clouds that dissipated almost instantly into the frozen air. The practical crisis was immediate. It was January 19th, the heart of winter on the high plains. The temperature had dropped to 14 below zero overnight, and the sky promised more snow before evening. Horses could not survive exposure in that cold without shelter, especially animals already weakened by panic and burns. Every private barn and shed within 5 miles was already full of its owner's livestock. The town had no covered space left, no livery, no wagon shed large enough to house 8 uninjured horses, let alone the additional teams that would surely need shelter when the next blizzard arrived. The council had managed to save public funds but not public infrastructure, and now the horses of Clearwater faced slow death by frost. Harlan Webb convened an emergency council meeting at noon in the schoolhouse, the only public building still warm. The 4 other councilmen sat slumped on children's benches while the chairman paced the narrow aisle. His voice was hoarse from smoke and cold, but the authority in it had not yet broken. "We need a roof and walls today," he said. "Not tomorrow, tonight." The councilmen offered suggestions. The church basement was too small. The mill owner's barn was already packed with 20 head of cattle. Someone proposed building a temporary shelter from the burned timbers of the old stable, but the wood was too far gone, and there was no time to mill new lumber. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the wind rattling the loose window panes. It was the oldest councilman, a German immigrant named Otto Dreher, who finally spoke the thing no one wanted to say. Otto had missed the vote back in April because of a fever, and he had never quite agreed with the pig ordinance, though he had not fought it either. He cleared his throat and leaned forward, his knobby fingers gripping the edge of a child's desk. "There is the stone building on the hill," he said, "the one the woman built for her pigs." The silence thickened. Harlan Webb stopped packing. His jaw tightened. "That's a pigsty," he said. "It's 40 feet long and solid as a fortress," Otto replied quietly. "And she built it with her own hands while this council told her she was wasting time. It will hold every horse we have left, and it will not burn if the world catches fire again." The chairman turned toward the window and stared at the distant hillside where Mia's stone palace stood. Even from this distance, the dark shape of it was visible against the white slope, a low-slung silhouette that had once been a town joke. He said nothing, but every man in the room could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. That afternoon, a small delegation rode up the frozen track toward Mia's property. Harlan Webb led them on a borrowed horse, since both his own were dead. He was accompanied by Otto Dreher and the town clerk, a thin, nervous man named Ellis who kept licking his cracked lips and glancing back toward town as if expecting the rescue of a miracle. The wind blew steadily from the north, carrying fine grains of snow that stung the face like sand. When the riders crested the final rise, they saw the pig palace fully for the first time. Not from a distance, not from the road, but up close, and the sight stopped them cold. The walls were built from rough limestone slabs fitted so precisely that the gaps between them were barely visible. The roof was a low arch of cedar beams covered with sod and stone, green with winter moss along the edges. The entrance yawned dark and square beneath a heavy lintel, and from inside came the faint sound of animals moving in warm straw. Smoke curled from a small iron chimney at the peak. The whole structure radiated permanence. It looked like something a medieval lord might have built for his war horses, not a pigsty. Mia met them at the gate. She had seen the glow of the fire from her hilltop the night before, and she had been expecting visitors. She wore her wool trousers and a heavy coat patched at the elbows. Her dark hair was pinned up and her expression was unreadable. The dog, a caramel-colored stray she had raised from a pup, sat at her feet with its ears flattened against the wind. "Chairman Webb," she said. Her voice was neutral. "You've lost something." The words hung in the cold air with no venom and no sympathy, just a simple statement that carried the entire history of the previous spring inside it. Harlan Webb dismounted stiffly. His breath came hard and white. "We need shelter for the town's horses," he said. "We have 8 animals that will freeze without walls tonight. The council is prepared to pay a fair sum for the use of your building until a new stable can be raised." He paused and then added, "You would be helping the entire town." Mia looked past him toward the distant charred scar where the public stable had stood. She could still see the thin column of smoke rising into the gray sky. Then she turned back toward the low stone doorway behind her, where her Berkshire sow had wandered out to root at the trampled snow. The pig grunted softly and turned in a circle before settling down in a patch of yellow straw just inside the entrance. "This is a pigsty, Mr. Webb," Mia said. "You made that very clear to me last spring. Pigs do not belong in town. This is where my pigs live." She rested one hand on the stone jamb. "You are asking me to stable your horses in my pigsty. The same council that banished my livestock from the commons because they were a nuisance is now standing on my land asking for a favor." She let the silence stretch. The dog whined once, then went quiet. "I am not unreasonable," Mia said at last. "Horses can be brought up tonight. The inner pen is large enough for 8 animals, and I have straw, feed, and water. But I am not a charity, and I am not a public institution. If you want to use my building, you will pay me rent." She paused again. "In coin, or in something else?" The clerk looked nervously at the chairman. Harlan Webb's face had flushed beneath the windburn. He understood immediately that she was not just negotiating a price. She was offering him a choice between 2 kinds of currency, and he could already guess what the second one was. "What is your rate?" he asked, his voice tight. Mia smiled for the first time, a small cold smile that did not reach her eyes. "I'm glad you asked," she said. She let the silence hang long enough for the wind to do her explaining for her. Then she laid out the terms in a voice that carried no anger, only the flat clarity of a woman who had already done the arithmetic. "The rate is $1 per horse per night, paid in advance at sundown. Hay and water are included because I am not cruel to animals, but that is the coin price. If an owner prefers not to pay in silver, I will accept a different settlement." A public apology before the town council, read aloud by the owner himself, acknowledging that the hog ordinance was a mistake and that my animals were never a nuisance to Clearwater. One apology covers 1 horse for the full duration of the winter. The choice belongs to each owner. Harlan Webb's face went wooden. He had come expecting a negotiation over a few nickels, perhaps a grudging favor called in from a lone woman who would fold under the weight of civic need. What he got instead was a tariff on pride. The clerk, Ellis, shifted in his saddle and looked away. Otto Dreher, who had suggested this visit, let out a slow breath that fogged in the cold and said nothing at all. Mia had not offered them warmth, tea, or even the pretense of neighborly feeling. She stood in the doorway of her stone fortress with her dog at her feet and her sow snoring softly in the straw, and she waited for their answer. The chairman tried to stall. "We'll need to discuss this with the full council," he said. "This is a town matter." Mia nodded toward the injured horses still huddled by the mercantile below. "Then discuss it quickly. The temperature is falling again. Horses die fast when the wind picks up after dark, and the sky is telling me we have maybe 3 hours before the next squall." She was right. The clouds stacking above the northern ridge had turned a bruised purple, and the light was draining from the basin faster than it should. Harlan Webb had spent enough winters on the frontier to recognize the signs. He looked at the stone walls behind her, at the low, heavy lintel that would never burn, at the cedar beams that would hold against any weight of snow, and he understood that she was not offering him a choice between 2 options. She was offering him a choice between humiliation right now and the death of animals that belonged to the leading men of his town. He chose humiliation. Within 2 hours, the first horses began the slow climb up the rocky track to Mia's pig palace. Townspeople lined the main street to watch. They saw the town clerk leading his nervous bay mare, a horse he had bought with his wife's inheritance and boarded at the public stable for safety. They saw the mill owner's 2 heavy Percherons stumbling with exhaustion through the frozen ruts. They saw Otto Dreher's old dappled gelding, the gentlest horse in the county, following placidly behind a farm boy who could not stop crying. And they saw Harlan Webb walking at the rear, leading no horse of his own, because both of his were blackened carcasses under the stable rubble, but carrying the weight of the council's surrender on his shoulders. Mia received each animal at the gate. She inspected hooves for ice cracks, checked eyes for smoke damage, and assigned a stall in the inner pen with the precision of a cavalry quartermaster. The pigs had been moved to the southern end of the building, separated by a low stone wall she had built years ago as a feed divider. Now it served as a boundary between two kingdoms. The Berkshire sow watched the horses file in with the mild curiosity of an animal that had never questioned its own comfort. Her shotes rustled in the straw and paid no attention at all. The horses, too exhausted and cold to care about the smell of swine, shuffled into the warm darkness and began to eat. By nightfall, the stone palace held 8 horses, 5 pigs, and 1 woman who had refused to be pushed off her land. The snow arrived exactly as Mia had predicted. It came in sideways gusts that rattled the shutters of every house in Clearwater, but inside the thick limestone walls the draft was barely noticeable. The horses stamped occasionally and settled. The pigs grunted in their sleep. Mia sat on an upturned bucket near the iron stove, her dog's head resting on her knee, and listened to the wind trying to find a crack that did not exist. The council met again the next morning, not in the schoolhouse this time but in the back room of the Mercantile, because the school was needed for children, and because the council no longer felt like a public institution. The snow had stopped, but the cold had deepened. Harlan Webb sat at the head of a barrel table with his hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm. Otto Dreher and the 2 other councilmen, a harness maker named Finch and a grain merchant named Lassiter, sat across from him. The clerk Ellis was there too, though no one had invited him. "We cannot pay $1 a horse forever," Finch said. "I have 3 horses in that building. That's $3 a day. I don't make $3 a week in January." Lassiter nodded. "The grain stores are frozen solid. Nobody is buying, nobody has coin." The chairman listened without speaking. Then Otto Dreher cleared his throat again, the same dry sound he had made in the schoolhouse the day before. "One of my horses is in that building," he said. "I paid the coin, but Ellis paid in apologies." He stood up in front of the council and read a statement that woman wrote for him. He paused. The statement said the ordinance was a mistake. It said her pigs were never a public nuisance. It said the council acted without cause. Another pause. The whole town heard it. The room was quiet. Ellis stared at the floor. He had paid in apologies because he had no coin, and because Mia had told him quietly that the first man to apologize would set a precedent that might save the others from something worse. He had believed her, or he had needed to believe her, and so he had stood in the schoolhouse the previous evening before the horses were even warm in their stalls and read the words she had written on a scrap of paper. It had taken him less than a minute, and when he finished, he had walked out into the cold and vomited behind the woodpile. "We could build a new stable," Lassiter said. "The ground is frozen 3 feet deep," Otto replied. "The sawmill is frozen too. The only timber in town is stacked behind the church, and the pastor says it belongs to God." "Then we build in the spring," Finch said. "The horses will be dead by spring," Otto said. That was when the chairman spoke. His voice was lower than it had been the day before, lower and thinner, as though something vital had drained out of him during the night. "We are not going to build anything," he said. "We are going to pay the woman what she asks, and we are going to learn to live with the consequences of what we did last April." He looked around the room. "I signed that ordinance. So did you, Finch. So did you, Lassiter. We signed it because we didn't like the way she dressed, the way she talked, the way she looked at us like we were something beneath her. And now we are paying her for the right to board our horses in a building she built with her own hands while we were calling her a nuisance." He stood up. "The council will pay for the horses that belong to the town. The rest of you will settle your accounts as you see fit. This meeting is over." But it was not over, not even close, because 3 days later the second blizzard hit, and it was worse than the first. The storm rolled down from the territories with a fury that even the old trappers said they had not seen in 30 years. It lasted 5 days. 5 days of white darkness so complete that farmers could not find their own barns without a rope line. 5 days of snow drifting up over windows and packing hard against doors until whole families were trapped inside their cabins with nothing but what they had stored. 5 days of wind that screamed across the prairie like something wounded and furious. When the sky finally cleared, the town of Clearwater emerged from the storm to find itself half buried and entirely broken. 2 wooden sheds had collapsed under the weight of the drifts. A section of the mercantile roof had caved in, ruining Lassiter's grain stores beyond recovery, and the site where the public stable had stood was now a white mound indistinguishable from any other patch of snow. There was no rebuilding. There was no alternative shelter. Mia's stone palace stood exactly as it had before the storm. The snow had drifted against the walls, but the walls did not yield. The roof held. Inside, the horses were alive, all 8 of them, and so were the pigs. The fire in the stove had burned low but never gone out. Mia had spent the 5 days moving between the animal pens and her small corner bed, checking hooves and water buckets and the temperature of the stone floor. She had stockpiled enough hay and oats to last through a month of isolation because she had planned for exactly this, and now the council knew it. The coin ran out first. Finch could not pay beyond the first week. Lassiter, his grain ruined, had nothing left. The 2 men rode up the hill together on a gray morning and asked to speak with Mia. They did not negotiate. They simply asked what she wanted them to say, and she told them. On the following Sunday, the schoolhouse was packed. Every family in Clearwater had gathered for what was supposed to be a town meeting, though everyone knew what it really was. Harlan Webb sat in the back row. He had already paid in coin for the town's 2 horses, using funds from the empty treasury, but his face was as gray as the sky outside. Finch and Lassiter stood at the front of the room. They read their apologies one after the other, their voices flat and cracked. The words were Mia's, not theirs. They admitted that the pig ordinance had been an act of personal spite. They admitted that her animals had never caused harm. They admitted that the council had abused its authority to punish a woman who had done nothing except refuse to be small. When they finished, no one clapped. No one spoke. The silence was heavier than any storm, but the twist was still coming. Because as the weeks passed and the winter grudgingly loosened its grip, a rumor began to circulate through Clearwater. It started with the stonemason from Wisconsin who had visited in October and then reappeared in February on his way back east. He mentioned to the postmaster that Mia had written to him months before the fire, asking detailed questions about ventilation, weight loads, and fireproof construction. Not for pigs, he said, for horses. She had asked specifically about horses. The postmaster told his wife. His wife told the preacher. The preacher told Otto Dreher, who did not repeat it but simply nodded to himself as though a puzzle piece had clicked into place. The truth that Clearwater slowly came to understand was this. Mia had not built a pigsty that happened to be large enough for horses. She had built a fireproof stable from the very beginning, a deliberate shelter designed to survive exactly the kind of disaster that frontier towns suffered every few winters. She had known the public stable was a tinderbox. She had known the council would push her off the commons. She had known that someday, probably soon, they would need her. And she had built her stone palace not as an act of defiance but as an act of quiet, patient, inevitable revenge. The pigs were never the point. They were just the excuse. Once the rumor reached Harlan Webb, it was already too late to undo anything. The postmaster's wife had told the preacher's wife, and the preacher's wife had told the harness maker's daughter, and by the time the chairman heard it from his own son at the breakfast table, the whole town knew or suspected. That letter to the stonemason existed. Mia had written it in September of 1883, a full month before the ordinance passed, asking about the exact dimensions of a cavalry stable, the ideal distance between stalls to prevent the spread of fire, and whether limestone walls would hold heat longer than brick. The mason had answered her questions one by one, not knowing what she intended, and he had kept the letter because he found it admirably thorough. Now the letter was being passed from hand to hand in Clearwater like a forbidden relic, and the men who had signed the pig ordinance read it with a growing sickness in their stomachs. The council called one final meeting in the third week of February, but this time no one pretended it was a public proceeding. They met in Otto Dreher's kitchen, because Otto was the only councilman whose reputation was still intact. He had not signed the ordinance. He had not made jokes about the woman in trousers. He had simply watched the whole affair unfold with the patience of a man who had crossed an ocean in his youth and knew that justice sometimes took years to arrive. The other councilmen sat around his pine table like men awaiting a sentencing. Harlan Webb looked diminished, his shoulders curled inward, his voice barely above a whisper. He held the mason's letter in both hands and read it aloud while the fire popped in the stove behind him. She asked about maximum snow load on a flat roof, he read. She asked about the burn point of cedar versus pine. She asked whether horses could be housed with swine without risk of disease, and the mason replied that they could, provided the drainage was separate. Webb looked up. She knew. Before we even passed the ordinance, she knew. Finch, who had apologized publicly with Mia's words in his mouth, slammed his palm on the table. Then she built that thing as a trap. She baited us. The whole pig ordinance was just the excuse she needed to build a stable on her own land, and we handed it to her. Otto Dreher removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly with a cloth. You handed it to her, he said. You and Lassiter and Mr. Webb. You passed an ordinance against a woman who had done nothing but let her pigs forage where they had always foraged. You gave her the grievance. She simply built a solution before you knew you needed it. The chairman set the letter down and stared at the grain of the tabletop. She could have warned us about the stable. She could have told us the building was a fire hazard. She watched 41 horses burn. Otto shook his head. You would not have listened. You called her a nuisance. You stood on her land and told her she was wasting her time. Why would she warn men who would not hear her? The silence that followed was the hollowest sound the council had ever made. Spring came slowly to Clearwater that year, but when it came, it brought changes. The town built a new public stable, smaller than the old one, and this time constructed with thick stone walls at the insistence of the council that had learned a bitter lesson. The mason from Wisconsin was hired to oversee the work, and he used the same limestone from the same ridge where Mia had quarried her palace. No one objected to the irony. Several families had already left Clearwater by then, driven out by the hard winter and the harder truths it had exposed. Others stayed and simply learned to live with the new order of things. Mia continued to live on her 40 acres, raising pigs and selling them for a profit in the summer markets. She never joined the church, never changed her manner of dress, never offered anything to the town that was not first asked and paid for. And the town, for its part, never bothered her again. The stone palace still stood on the hillside, visible from the main road, and travelers passing through Clearwater often asked about it. The townspeople told different versions of the story depending on who was listening. Some said it was a stable built by a clever woman who had once outsmarted the council. Others said it was a monument to a winter when the powerful had been made humble. A few said it was simply a pigsty, and that was true enough, because the pigs still lived there alongside whatever horses happened to be boarding through the cold months. The building earned a name. They called it the Banner Barn because it had sheltered the horses of the very men who had tried to banish her, and the banners of their pride had been folded and stored inside it like old flags. But the final surprising detail, the thing that people only learned years later, came from Ellis, the former town clerk. Ellis had moved away to a county to the south and taken a job in a land office, and one evening in a saloon, he told the full truth to a stranger. He said that Mia had not just foreseen the fire. She had predicted the exact night it would happen, not because she was clairvoyant, but because she had walked through the public stable in December on the pretense of selling a sack of oats. She had seen the lantern hooks loose in the hayloft, the hay stacked against the back wall, the single exit door that froze shut every night. She had stood in that stable for less than 5 minutes and calculated the odds with the same cold precision she had used to stack her stones. Then she had gone home and waited. Ellis had seen the calculation in her eyes on the night of the fire, when he had brought his bay mare up the hill and she had received him without surprise, as though she had been expecting him at exactly that hour. He never told anyone in Clearwater, because by then it no longer mattered. The fire had already become part of the town's history. The Banner Barn had already become a landmark. And Mia had already become something the town could not explain, a woman who had listened to silence and read the future in it. The winter of 1883 faded into the memory of the plains, but the lesson of the Stone Palace did not. Years later, when new families arrived in Clearwater and old ones passed away, the story was still told around stoves and in church basements. It changed shape with every telling, as stories do. In some versions, Mia was a vengeful witch who had summoned the fire with a curse. In others, she was a frontier saint who had saved the town's horses when no one else could. But in the version that Otto Dreher told his grandchildren, which was the truest version, she was neither. She was simply a woman who understood that the people who humiliate you today will need you tomorrow, and that the wise thing to do is build the shelter before they come knocking. That, Otto said, was the difference between a fool and a prophet. A fool waits for the fire to believe it is coming. A prophet builds a stone barn while the council is still laughing. The stone walls Mia raised on that hillside stood for more than 60 years. Long after Clearwater grew from a rough frontier stop into a proper town with brick buildings and graded roads, the Banner Barn remained. The pigs eventually passed, replaced by new generations of shoats that knew nothing of the fire or the council. The horses that wintered there came and went, and their owners eventually stopped feeling the sting of the arrangement. Some even began recommending the place to travelers, not as a curiosity, but as the soundest stable in the county. The fire became a story told to children. The apologies faded into town minutes that nobody bothered to preserve. And Mia herself grew old on that same 40 acres, walking the same perimeter her dog had once guarded, until one spring she simply did not wake, and the town buried her in a plot overlooking the valley. The building outlasted her by decades, and by the time the walls finally crumbled, the story had already been carved deeper into the memory of the plains than any gravestone. The question the old trapper Elias Crow once asked about Parker Vale echoes here too. Was Mia truly brilliant, or was she simply one of the few people willing to listen to what the council had been teaching her all along? She did not summon the fire. She did not rig a lantern to fall. She merely saw what happens when hay meets oil in a building with one frozen door. She saw what happens when men in power mistake cruelty for governance. She saw that humiliation is a debt that collects interest, and that the wisest thing an outcast can do is build a bank where that interest can be deposited. The Stone Palace was not a trap. It was a receipt for everything the council had charged her, and when the bill came due, she cashed it in full. Every institution that punishes the people it later needs writes itself into a version of this story. The employee pushed out for speaking truth, then called back when the crisis arrives. The neighbor shunned for being different, then asked for help when the flood comes. The woman laughed at for building too large too soon, who turns out to have built exactly what the community could not foresee it would need. Those moments are not accidents. They are the predictable consequence of a society that confuses conformity with safety and punishes the people who see clearly. The only question is whether anyone remembers the pattern before the fire starts. Mia's pigs were never the nuisance the council claimed them to be. They were just animals doing what animals do, rooting in the earth for whatever was hidden there. And perhaps that was the truest image of the whole affair. Because while the town was looking at the surface, at the dirt and the smell and the impropriety of a woman in trousers, Mia was already looking at what lay beneath. She saw the weak beams. She saw the loose lantern hooks. She saw the frozen ground that would prevent a new stable from rising before spring. She saw a future that the men who dismissed her could not imagine, and she built a monument to their blindness while they were still congratulating themselves on their wisdom. So the next time someone tells you that you are wasting your time, that your work is too big, too strange, too unnecessary, consider the stone palace on the hill. Consider the woman who stacked limestone in the cold while the council laughed. Consider the night the fire came and the only warm horses in Clearwater were the ones standing in a pigsty. The thing you are building today might look absurd to the people around you, but you are not building it for today. You are building it for the night when everything else burns down and the people who mocked you come knocking on your door with cold hands and empty pockets. What you choose to charge them is up to you. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell so you never miss a story about the people who saw it coming before anyone else did, because the fire is always already on its way. The only difference between the victims and the architects is that the architects started building before the smoke appeared.